Tonight we're starting our work on Chapter 4. The topic here is server controls. And this is a really very important concept when you're working in a .NET environment. And you guys have done some programming already with Visual Studio where you have been actually kind of using controls in some capacity and not really being aware of it. And you probably have not had them called server controls. In some cases, we just call them controls. Other environments, they call them user controls. In fact, depending on the book that you're looking at, they'll often call them user controls or server controls. And there's little distinctions, and I'm hoping we can kind of clear up what those mean. The topics for the chapter, you see the 5 bullets up there at the top. And we're going to start with what the heck they are, which is a good thing. I like my little highlight there. It says they're the workhorses of ASP.NET, and that's absolutely true because what they do is we have these pre-configured little components we can pull into our projects and use as we need. And one of the reasons people like working in Visual Studio is we have some of these tools that help that, accelerate the workflow. And, if you don't have to build it from scratch, why would you? Right? You take the thing that's pre-built and you use it and you leverage it and you customize it. There's a lot of different types of server controls. One thing that you guys have already learned is when you are writing ASP.NET code, the ASP code, right, the tags that we write that are not HTML, that are not JavaScript, that are not CSS, that are not C#, those are ASP tags and they require the server to execute. The C# requires the server to execute as well, but that's a programming language and ASP.NET has its own language on top of it all. And the tags that you write with ASP.NET, when they execute on the server, they become something else, usually in the form of a visual output or some sort of object on the screen that the user can interface with and manipulate either to input data or receive data or control the screen or enter information. What you're seeing here in a real rudimentary fashion is a very primitive version. And you remember when we were using these ASP style tags and we were doing things like calling the time and the date and putting it up on the screen. That's a rudimentary form of that. When we are actually working with more of a proper ASP tag, you're going to see a declaration that looks like this, where it is going to say ASP, and then it'll tell us what type of thing that we're working with. So the generic form is the one at the top there that I highlighted. So it'll tell you what type of control it is, it'll give it an ID, and then it gives it the little directive, run at server. It requires the server in order to execute and do whatever it is it needs to do. One example is that one just below there, which is a text box. And if I run that little snippet of ASP code on my page, the server will interpret it and then give me to the output what it is that thing should be. In this case, it would generate a text box, and in terms of what it looks like as HTML, it will basically turn into an input field that we would know in HTML as an input of type text. But ASP.NET converts it to that when it executes. Now, the thing that you might ask yourself is, all right, but if I can just write it with HTML, why should I bother writing it with ASP? Well, the reason is because you have programmatic control over the ASP, in many cases much more so than you would with HTML or JavaScript. In some cases, you will use straight HTML because it's warranted. In other cases, if you're working in this environment and you're adding text boxes and things and you want to programmatically control them and you know that ahead of time, you're just going to use the ASP stuff because, in many cases, you're going to just drag and drop it in. Or you're going to let the IntelliSense fill it in for you. I know I need a text box, I'll type ASP : start typing text, and it just drops it in. All right, we've done a little bit of this stuff here, so this is pretty common looking, I suppose. So let's go ahead and do some of this work. I have my Visual Studio up and running. before I began, I made a copy of my work. So this is the folder where I'm keeping my stuff. I have chapter 3 complete, and what I did off screen is I made a copy of my completed work, pasted it, and I still have my folder here to work from. So when I'm going to go into Visual Studio and open up the project, I'm closing the start page, and I'm actually going to pull it up from the file menu, and we're going to do an open website. And this procedure is pretty common for you guys now. You're comfortable with this, I assume? You can see that site's already highlighted. You click open. All right, I'm going to pull the book off to my second screen here and read from it as we work. All right, the first thing they want us to do obviously is open the project, but the second step says in the demos folder, we're going to create a brand new web form called controls-demo.aspx. So to do that, click on the folder, demos, right click, choose add, and then you can go right to web form and give it the name. So they want controls demo, and if you want to put in the file extension here, you can. If you don't, it will automatically add it. Now, have you noticed that I'm not doing what the book is really telling us to do? They want us to go add new item and go into that list and find it. I know for a fact that this is going to create it as a C# page because the whole project is C#. If you wanted, and you're not comfortable doing that approach, just use the add new item, go to this interface, you can choose your language, you can choose your web form, and the same thing will happen. You can also designate whether it goes into a separate file for the code, but that's the default. That's why I was comfortable with just going ahead and clicking that one box. Of course, if it doesn't do what you want it to do, delete it and do it again. Want to see how you do that? You just come up here to the controls demo, delete. And it's gone. Want me to do it the long way? Right click, add new item, web form. We are C#, it says so right here as well. We're calling it controls demo. Code's in a separate file. That should be your default, like 99.9% of the time. And then click add. So now we have a brand new page here. They want us to switch over to design view. They also want us to pull up the toolbox, and then from that toolbox they want us to add a few things to the page. And let's see, their list says drag a text box, and notice the tools that I'm pulling in, the items that I'm pulling in, are part of the standard category, so stuff you tend to use most often. So I'm just expanding that. So they want a text box, and I'm assuming they want them in this order, a button, just drag and drop, and a label. Not very pretty, but they're there. All right, now here it says type the text, your name, in front of the text box. So now what I'm doing to make sure that it's in front of the text box, I don't know if you noticed, I just took my cursor and I clicked inside the box somewhere other than where these things are, like at the very end. And now I'm going to just take my arrow key and I'm arrowing left, and you see how I'm kind of like arrowing through the objects? And that text box was the last thing that was highlighted, and I arrowed left one more time, and you can kind of see the cursor flashing there. Maybe you guys can't make it out too clearly, but I'm going to type and you'll see that I'm in front of the text box. If you happen to not be in front of it and your text ends up, let's say, here, just Control Z or delete the stuff and just keep arrowing until you get to that spot. That's obviously not the text I want, though, so they wanted me to type your name. And then it says, and add a line break between the button and the label. What the heck is a line break? When I just see how where my cursor is right now, it's right after the button. And I just use the arrow key to do this, and I'm just going to press enter. That's a line break. If I looked at my code, notice that because I was inside that div and I pressed enter in between the button and the label, it threw in a BR tag. You guys should know that from your HTML. Do you guys notice that this BR tag has a self-closing slash in it? Well, there's a reason for that. If we were doing straight HTML5, that closing slash is not required. But because we're writing an application and the application executes code, and we're using an XML namespace, that BR tag being in this form, not that it would break the other way, but it makes it compile better in terms of an application. So we're just going with whatever Visual Studio is putting in there. We're trusting it. You could also come in here and type it in manually. That's not a problem. Notice that all the stuff that I added to the screen, though, how it's got that ASP directive in front of it. Okay, so that's one of the things. This is different than typing input type text. This is the ASP version. All right, so hopefully our screen kind of looks like that. Now it says right-click the button control. So we got to be in the design view for that. So switch back. Right-click the button control and choose properties. Now, whether you know it or not, properties are always open down here anyhow by default, but just in case they're not, this would bring it up. But you can click it and it just puts you right down into the box. And it says there's a shortcut key for that too. So if I selected the button and pressed F4, it would put me in properties as well. And then what they want us to do is change some things about the button. The one thing they want us to change is to come down here and change the text field of the button to say, you can just type right in there, submit information. And then if you press enter or tab out of that field or click off of that field, you'll see how the button text changed. This is something you should already be familiar with from Intro to Programming, I hope, if you've had that class. The other part of this that we want to set is a property just called ID. And I'm going to scroll up to the top here. And that's where I'm used to seeing mine. But wait, it's all the way at the bottom. And what's happening here, if you're not familiar with how Visual Studio does things, you see this little row of icons in the property window up at the top? The default organization for items in the property window is by category. Okay? So, in other words, if we were doing something that was relative to the behavior, then there's a group of properties that are related to it, and you can go to it, and you can collapse the groups if you want. But if you're having a hard time finding a particular field, but you know what the field is by name, like I'm looking for ID, I can actually click this second button over, and it just switches everything to alphabetical, right? And now text is with all the other things that start with T, and then if you want, you'll see that I prefer to work with the alphabetical mode myself. I mean, that's just a preference thing. Depends on what I'm doing, obviously. But that way I always know that my ID is at the top. and I'm going to come in here and change that, and they want us to change it to submit button. Be careful, spaces are not allowed in IDs. Press enter. If you take a moment and you pop over your source code view and take a look, do you see that the text, what's on the button, is right here? And it just so happens to match the property name. Also that the ID is now submit button as opposed to some generic thing like label 1. You know, Visual Studio is good about auto-labeling things, but often that's not useful when you're coding. So it's good to know that which button is it? It's the submit button. You know, which text field is it? It's the first name box, not text box 1. So it's a good habit to start changing it. It also says that we should change the ID of the text box using the properties grid. So in other words, we're going to go back to the design view. We are going to click on the text box and then come down here and change the ID, which is at the top, to your name. They also want us to change the text property of the label. The label is this little bit down here. But just to show you that you don't have to do it through the properties window, you can go right to the code to do it. I'm just going to come down here and change it right inside the markup. And they want us to set the ID to result. And are you noticing that on the right, this is the properties window for that label and how to change there as well? Okay, back to design view. Now we're going to come up to the button and we're going to give it a double click. If you've done any Visual Studio work before, you know that when you double click a control on a page, that it generates a code stub for you on the code page. So in other words, whatever the most common action is for that control, that's the little snippet of code that it's going to write. The default action for a button is a click. So it writes basically an event handler that responds to a click by default. So in other words, the code I put inside here is the code that's going to execute when I click the button when the application is running. What they want us to do is drop in this one little snippet of text. Let's see if I can copy it here. So I'm just copying this straight from the book. Now what's interesting about this is notice that what we're doing is it's finding the object on the screen by name. In other words, by name meaning its ID, right? Because we changed. Now, you guys are saying, wait, we're working with a button, aren't we? Is that what you're thinking? We are. But what we're saying is whatever object is named result, we know that that's the label, the text property of that object is going to become your name is, and we're going to concatenate your name.text. What is your name? Yeah, it's the text box that we created. Remember we gave it an ID? So if I went back to the page, and I could look at either the source code or the properties window, but let's say I'm looking at the source code, the text box is named your name. The label's named result, the button's named submit button. So if I go back to the code page up here, the C# page, so what that's saying is that the label text is going to say your name is whatever is in the text box's text. Got it? So in other words, conceptually what's going to happen is we're going to run the page, somebody's going to type their name into that box, they're going to press the button and it's going to show up in the label. It's very simplistic, but it just shows you the capability. All right, next thing it wants us to do is to save the pages. So go do a Control-S to save each one of the pages. Can I give you guys a little hint? It's a good idea to save your work before you try to execute it and see it in the browser. But you know, if you just go ahead and hit the play button, it saves it for you. Just in case you didn't know. All right, so in order to see this one, make sure that you have that page highlighted and then hit the button. If you get a screen that says this, which you guys probably get often, my recommendation at this point is that you run it without debugging, because we're not really worried about debugging at this point. It'll still execute. There'll be times when you do want to debug. So if you do run it with debugging, it's going to create a web config file and tries to put some other components into the project. And then it might also throw a couple of errors here and there that might make you think you're not doing something right when really you're doing everything just fine. So when it says in the book, launch the page in the browser by pressing Control F5, that puts it into this mode automatically. And you don't have to make that selection. All right, let's go ahead and put it up on the screen. It says, wait, don't type anything or don't click the button yet. That's what it says in the instructions. But open up the source code of the page, so they want us to look at the source, and then take a look at how the stuff that we created in Visual Studio on this page, and I'm looking at this part here in particular, right? The ASP tags turned into HTML input tags, and the label turned into a span tag. Notice that they have the IDs, your name, and result. And IDs are critical when we're doing web programming, because IDs uniquely identify objects, and when they can be uniquely identified, then we can control them with code. And that's what it's all about. All right. And now they're saying go back to the browser and type in your name. I was going to come up with something quippy. Maybe this is better. You can press the button, and like magic, we have some results. Pretty simplistic, and I'm hoping everybody got that one to work. Oh, that was totally an accident. All right. Now the thing they also want you to do is, you hit that button and it did something, right? But now if we take a look at the source code again, notice that it rewrote the code in the page. Pretty slick, right? No JavaScript involved. Because what's happening is we have an ASP.NET application. If we did this with standard HTML, it would not do anything. It requires that C# code in the background to run. So that is completely obscured from the user. If we were to do something like this with JavaScript, JavaScript would be completely visible to the user that knows how to find it. All right, so that's not really that big a deal, right? Because lots of stuff is done with JavaScript. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But when you're starting to do like server-side interactions with things, working with server-side code allows you to hide stuff from the user they have no business seeing. They have no business seeing what your programmatic logic is, and they have no business knowing like what database fields you're interacting with. What would they care? They just want it to work. Everybody good with that tutorial so far? All right, so that's the first exercise complete. I'm going to bring the book back over onto the screen here. and we're going to press forward. So the author goes through and he describes basically the same thing that I just did. All right. Now, a lot of controls have properties. So like if you bring up any control on a page like we were doing, whatever you click on up here that is a control, and you can see down in the right-hand corner as I click between them how it changes. And you can scroll through that list and just take a look at some of the stuff that's available. Some of it might not make any sense to you at all, right? But there's others like maybe like tooltip, and you guys see what I typed there? You guys know what a tooltip is? Right. Yeah, if I launch this again and bring it up in the browser and then I hover over it, that's a tooltip. Who'd have thunk it, right? But there's lots of little properties like this that do things, and every one of the controls that we can pull in from that toolbar has properties. Some of them are common, and that's what they're kind of pointing out in the book here. So a lot of them have things like access keys and certain colors and widths, and the fact that you can add CSS classes to objects through the properties window. You don't have to do it in the code. So you can use whatever method is appropriate for you. You want to see my code on that? In the browser? Right. I didn't type that in. Well, I typed in the text, but I didn't add the HTML tag. But you see how it turned it into the HTML equivalent of the tooltip. In Visual Studio, of course, that is here in the source code. It's called a tooltip, but not in HTML. So we have like a conversion that happens. But the server executes the ASP code, and it turns into HTML in the browser. All right, back over to the book. I'm not going to describe every one of these little properties here because I think a lot of them are fairly intuitive, plus you have the capability of reading. But the common ones, the ones that are available to just about every tool, are the ones that you see in this particular list. He does the same thing I do. He goes through and he explains how those things convert from the ASP tags and then end up becoming something else. The other thing that you have the capability of doing, of course, is you can take any of the stuff that you're working with that has an ID, for example, or a class. So for example, if I went to the properties window in Visual Studio and I took, let's say, my label, and I came down here to the properties window and I found CSS class and I gave it a class name, what's going to happen is that is going to convert into that CSS class name that you see right here. And I'll highlight it, why not? Is when it executes, it will turn into HTML code that'll just say class equals text box. And then we can go ahead and style that control. So even though ASP is generating the HTML, it doesn't mean that we can't control its appearance. We have an anticipation that it's going to become a certain thing when it becomes HTML. And because it has a class or an ID, we can style it like anything else. So just because we're using something other than HTML to create it, doesn't mean we can't style it just like HTML. That's really the point there.
So by using that tool, you'll auto-generate a CSS page itself, or you need to make it yourself?
You need to still control the CSS manually.
But it won't create a page if there's not one that exists.
Basically, yes. Yeah, it's not going to create a CSS style for you. It's just creating a class. Yeah, and then you're ready to add the style. But yeah, but see, there is an advantage to working that way too, to pre-create the class name. And that way, if you haven't generated the class yet, then it's really easy because when you go to the CSS tools, you can find the class and add the style to it. right? And then if you already have the style pre-built, just type in the class name and boom, it changes in the design right away as well. So yeah, a powerful little tool. All right. There's lots of different types of controls. So we were looking at the toolbox and we saw, we did the text box and we did the button and the label, and you probably saw a lot of other ones there. So for example, one of the ones they're pointing out in the book is the fact that there's a hyperlink control. It's like, well, I know how to do a hyperlink with HTML. Why do I need ASP.NET to do it? Because it's programmatically controlled. You got to keep that in mind. Okay, so sometimes we can feed information into it, we can do stuff with it, we can manipulate it much more so than regular HTML. But all of these will have their properties, and they show you the list there. Of course, you can go take a look yourself. But they're talking about the standard section. One type of control that we're going to be looking at shortly is what we call a list control. And a list control is one of these things that creates a little HTML drop-down box that you guys maybe have seen in applications. And then notice here that the drop-down list has its own ASP tag style, and then the stuff inside the list are called list items. Kind of sounds like HTML as well, doesn't it? Sounds like an LI, because basically that's what it turns into. All right, so we're going to play with this particular tool. And this one is pretty fun. It's got some quirks to it, and you'll discover them as you're working. So if you want to do exactly what the book is doing, you got to read those instructions very carefully, and I'll try to make sure that I don't mess them up as I'm reading them myself. All right, it says in the demos folder, create a new web form called list controls. So let's do that. Right click. And I'm just going to choose web form. I'm entitling it list controls. Click OK. I want us to be in design view, so go ahead and do that. And then it wants you to come over here and drag a drop-down list and drop it into the checkered box there. I'm just adding it. Now notice as I dropped it in, it puts it in place, but it also throws up a dialog automatically, because a drop-down list is no good without stuff to drop down and list. So we basically have to do that part of it. So it says the menu pops up, and then it has this little thing here, and what they call these panels, they call them Smart Task Panels, if you want to know their name. I'm sure you guys will memorize that, right? All right, so it says it gives you a few options, and it says the first option enables you to bind the control to a data source, which is done much later in the book. Now, if you're wondering what that means that you could tie to a database table, for example. So if you had a database table that had the listing of, I don't know, all the students, you could attach it to that table and attach it to a particular thing, and it would automatically pull the data in. You wouldn't need to code a thing. The data is pre-existing, you just attach it. All right, the second thing, the one that we're going to end up using, edit items, is where you can go in and manually specify the stuff. And very often that is what you're going to do. But it's good to know that you can tie it into a database. The other option at the bottom is a postback option. And you probably haven't learned much about, postbacks. And really what we're referring to when you hear a phrase like that is that we are sending information back and forth to the server with our action. So when I click the box that says enable auto postback, in essence what it's doing is the moment I make a selection from that list, it communicates with the server and says, this is what he picked. And sometimes based upon what you picked, it will give you other options. So it says, you probably have code that's written that, if the guy selects, XYZ, then give him this other stuff, or take him there, or do this. So that can be done automatically. Now, they do make a note here in the book at the bottom of step 3, very bottom of the page of 118, that in order for the postback to work, to actively communicate with the server, you do have to have JavaScript running. And these days, like 99% of browsers are running JavaScript automatically, but some people every once in a while freak out and turn JavaScript off, and tends to break a lot of applications, really, because JavaScript kind of runs everything on the web, it seems. All right, let's go ahead and click the Edit Items option, and you're going to get this little window that pops up. And now we're going to start adding some stuff here to do a little bit of work. So the first thing I want you to do is click the Add button. And notice how it automatically creates a list item. And notice how it automatically puts the number 0 at the front of it. Right? And that's our index value. And the programming correlation is when you think of an array. Right? And you guys have learned about arrays. And if you even if you haven't, basically whenever computers start counting, they start counting at 0. Right? Because we use a base 10 number system. There's 10 individual digits. The first one is 0, not 1. So computers always start counting at 0. So list items do get an index value because that also allows for programmatic control. So the second one's going to get the number 1, the third one's going to get the number 2. All right. All right, so then it says we added the list item, and then in the properties grid on the right, enter C# for the text property. And this is basically what's going to appear in the drop-down list. And then press the Tab key. And notice that what happens is the moment I press the Tab key, it also locked in the value, but it also changed the value field to C# as well. But if you want, it doesn't have to be C#. You could change it still manually to something else. All right. Now they want us to repeat that procedure 2 more times, and we're going to add list items for Visual Basic and CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to come over here and say Add. I'm going to click on Text. I'm going to say Visual Basic. Come back and click Add. And then I'm going to type in CSS. When you're all done, go ahead and click OK. And then the thing you should do is you should switch over to the code view per the recommendation, and then just take a really quick look at what we created. So, I mean, once you see what the pattern is, right? I mean, you might not know the code that the control generates automatically, but now that I've done a couple, it would be easy for me to come in here and add a couple of other things just by typing. It wouldn't take much. All right, now the next thing that we're going to do is we're moving on to step 6 on page 120. And it says in markup view, that's where you see the code, drag a checkbox list control from the toolbox directly into the code window right after the drop-down list. So in other words, I'm going to come here and take a checkbox list, and now I'm not dropping it into design view this time, I'm dropping it into the markup. And you can do that. So I can bring it and put it right here. So not only can you drag and drop those controls on to a visual page, you can also do it directly into code. That's a pretty handy little thing. Then it says copy the 3 ASP list items, these 3. So I'm doing a Control C to copy. Excuse me. And it says paste them between the opening and closing tags of the checkbox list. So in other words, right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press enter and then drop them in. So it should look like that when you're done. So it's just showing you that there's a drop-down list, there's a checkbox list. They're 2 different type of things, but they both use the same kind of list items. List items are list items. Now it wants us to jump back over to Design View. And it says drag a button from the toolbox and put it to the right of the checkbox list control. So in other words, we're going to drop it over here somewhere. Take a button and drag and drop it. Somebody is saying no. What am I doing wrong? Don't I need to put it in that little arrow? No. No. It says in the instructions, it says Design View, drag a button to the right of the checkbox list control. The button will be placed below the checkbox lists. So they're just showing you that if I Control Z that, like right now the parameters of what we're working in are inside this box. And if I try to take this button and drop it here, it gets outside of the structure. By putting it over here, it tries to put it in after, but because it's a block level item, it moves it down to the next line. It says next, drag a label control and drop it to the right of the button. So I'm going to grab the label, drop it to the right of the button, so right here. And even though it doesn't look great right now, don't worry about that. But it says create some room between the button and the label by positioning your cursor between the controls. And you see the way I'm doing it is I'm just arrowing. You can try to get your mouse in there, and that might be hard. If you're having a hard time doing that, just click to where you can see the cursor and just use your arrow key to get in between. Then they want you to press enter twice. And then double click the button so we can look at the code. Alright, so now we're on step 9. Then inside this piece of code here, right where the cursor is flashing, grab the C# code from the book. So I'm going to have to do this in pieces because it spans 2 pages. So there's the first line. And here is the remainder. Yes? Now, if you copy and paste your code in for this particular step, when you're done, it should look something like this. Okay, so try to get your stuff into that shape. It is important where things are nested with the curly brackets. And I know that some of you are probably going to want to try to type it in. That's fine. I would encourage you to copy paste from an electronic version if you have it available. One of the reasons is just to kind of avoid making mistakes in typing. All right. Go ahead and save all your stuff. And then go ahead and launch the application. And let's take a look and see what happens in the browser. So now you have an example of all the different types of controls. Notice that we have the C# drop-down box here. Now, of course, we didn't program these to do anything, but just to show you what the objects look like. And we have a checkbox list. We have our button. How did that happen? We wrote the code for it, right? Okay. There's code that we wrote in C#, and we just kind of pasted it in. We didn't even talk about it, right? What's going on here is it's saying that the label 1 text, and this is relative to the button being clicked now. It's going to put out some text that says, in the DDL drop-down list, you selected, and whatever I selected in the drop-down list, see, C#. And then what it does is it can read that value like this. So it says drop-down list 1, that's the name of the drop-down list. It pulls back the property of selected value. So whatever you select can be addressed that way. Then it runs a little loop. If you haven't really done a lot of programming yet and you're not sure what a loop is, you'll learn about it in programming. But basically, it steps through each item in a list when you do a for each. And in this case, it's looking through the checkbox list. And then if the item that we're looking for is selected, then it's going to say what you selected. And that's going to happen when I click the button too. Now the question is, did I select anything when I push the button? And the answer is no, right? So if I click Visual Basic and I hit the button, and if I click CSS and maybe click CSS, see how it dynamically changes? All right. Once again, kind of simplistic, but it really shows the power of what you can do with some of these controls. Another tool that we're going to work with now is a tool called the panel control. So let's go back over to Visual Studio. So right now I'm working on the try it out exercise that's at the bottom of page 123. All right, and once again it wants us to create another new web form. So we're going to go to the demos folder. We are going to right click and we're going to add a web form. This one we're going to call containers. They want us to go into design view, and then what they want, let's see, they want a checkbox, we'll drop that in, and a panel control. And I'm trying to get them both into that box. So I have a checkbox and a panel control. Let's switch over to the markup view and just make sure that both of those things ended up inside the div tags. So they're nested within. All right. Next instruction says, give the checkbox control a meaningful description and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come up here and click on the checkbox, and they want us to change its text property to say something like show panel. And then as soon as I press enter, you can see that the text on the checkbox changed up here. It also says set its auto postback property to true. Now I arrange my stuff alphabetically, so I know that that's going to be up towards the top. And you can see that I found the property, and then on the right hand side there, and even though this isn't very, intuitive, because I see auto postback and you see false, you don't even know that there's a little drop down box until you actually click on it, and then you see what the options are. Of course true and false are kind of one or the other, but in some cases there's other options for certain controls from those little drop downs. All right. The next step says set the visible property of the panel control. So to get to the panel control, I'm now clicking down here. If you notice that the way that this looks right now, like it's clear to see where the checkbox is, but the panel just appears as another dashed box. But when I click on it, it does bring up the little ID tab so that we know that we're actually working with it. And they want us to come down here now and the properties for that set visible to false. Meaning what? It's going to disappear. But the thing is, it's not disappearing here, is it? In design view, we still see it. But when it renders, the way that we have the properties set right now will not show on the page. Okay? That is by design. All right. It says inside the panel control, type some text. For example, I am visible now. All right. Now, one of the things that they're pointing out about these panels are kind of a way to take a bunch of stuff and kind of bundle it together is really the best way to say it. You have the capability when you're working with a panel to add anything to that panel that you would normally add to any other page construct. You want to type in some text, put in some HTML tags, drop other controls into it, you can totally do that. But by bundling them, you have the capability of, like in this case, turning them all on and off at the same time, making them visible and invisible all in one fell swoop. So that's kind of cool. All right. It says now, if necessary, switch to markup view and locate the code for the checkbox, which is right here. Put your cursor right before the closing forward slash, which is right here on my screen. I'm going to zoom out one click. So right here, and type on. And then you can see IntelliSense kicks in, and they want you to select on check changed. And then you can either press tab or enter to lock it in. Then they want you to put an equal sign in there, so you get the double quotes right away. They want us to create a new event. Then press tab. And you see how it did that? You want me to repeat that step? What they're trying to do here, folks, is they're trying to get you to get comfortable with the IntelliSense tools and show you how you don't really have to type a lot of stuff to get it to react to what you're doing. All right. Now the part that we're not aware of with what we chose is that we actually triggered some sort of an event thing, right? And the book is telling you that if you aren't aware that over in the C# file, it also automatically generated this little portion of code just by adding that property in. So now what this type of attribute does, check changed, it's just checking to see, did we click it, that checkbox? Did we unclick it? Either way, you're changing its state. So whatever that check is, it changed, and then we can actually write code to react to that, which is what we're going to do. And I think you can probably anticipate that what's going to happen is you check it, it shows the panel, you uncheck it, it hides the panel. That's kind of the goal here. Is that a way of turning it on and off? If you don't like, you're saying you don't like IntelliSense? All right, so to add the code now, being on step 7, page 125, I'll go back to the C# file here for a moment, and I'm going to grab the code from the book, paste it in. Now what this is saying is it's identifying the panel by name, and we're going to be triggering its visibility property. And you can see that it says that if it's checked, we're going to be triggering the property. All right, let's go ahead once again and check our work. Now, I always tell you to save your work and then hit the play button, but you know what? You can just hit the play button and you notice how the stuff just saved automatically. Shortcut, just so you know. All right, run without debugging. All right, and then the fun part, click the checkbox. It's the little things in life, right? I mean, that's a silly little effect, but at the same time, it's kind of useful, right? I mean, I can think of a lot of uses for something like that. All right, so that completes that try it out exercise. And I think you got plenty of like explaining how it works. So let's move on to the next one. The next exercise, we are at the bottom of page 126. They want us to keep that same page open, so the containers page. They also want you to be in design view. And it says, remove the text that says I am visible now. So I just highlighted and deleted. And then drag a wizard control from the toolbox inside the panel. So you see right down here the wizard control? Now if you add one of these, Merlin the magician jumps out and fixes everything for your code. Now, but you guys are kind of familiar with what wizards are in terms of Microsoft products. It's where they help guide you through doing certain things. All right. It says drag a wizard control from the toolbox inside the panel. Drag its right edge further to the right, increasing the total width of the control to 500 pixels. So let me just do that. I'll grab it, drop it into the panel, right? Is that what it said? Into the panel? Yeah, inside the panel. And then I'm going to grab the handle here on the right edge. I'm just going to drag it. And you can see that it tells you how many pixels it is, and they want us to get to 500. So I got lucky and got it exactly right. So now your page should look kind of like what you see in the book, or kind of like what I have up on my screen here. Now, the wizard control has that little smart panel thing. And if you're not seeing it, that little box here can invoke it. Right up here. All right, so now we're going to do add remove wizard steps. And you can see it pre-populated 2 steps, right? Okay, and I'll think of this from a logical standpoint. If you're going to give somebody in like a step-by-step, right? If there's more than one step, you know, chances are, I mean, that's probably going to be the case, right? I mean, if there's only one step, why do you need a step-by-step? If the step is just do it, you don't really need a list, do you? All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to add, click the add button to add a 3rd step. And then we're going to come back up to step 1, and we're going to change its title to About You. And then the second one's going to be called Favorite Language. And the third one's going to be called Ready. Now, after I typed in each one, what I did is I pressed the Tab key, which locks it in. All right. Now, step number 4, it says change the step type of the second step, favorite language that is. So right here, to step type. They want us to change that to auto. Right? No, that's not correct. To finish. Yeah. I'm going to tell you with this particular exercise, you got to be really careful with your steps. If some of you have probably already figured this out, so you're probably pensively watching to see me screw it up too. Right. Okay. Kind of figured. And of the last step to complete. So ready is going to switch to complete. Leave the first one alone, and then go ahead and click OK. Now back to design view. It says click About You. I think I need to close this panel. There we go. Okay, so what we're looking to do here, if you're not figuring it out, is that we want to click on About You so that it's bold. So we know that that's the thing that we're working with currently. Now it says add a drop-down list. All right, so they want a drop-down list basically to go into this box here. So go ahead and grab a drop-down list and drag it in there. They want its ID set to favorite language. All right, once again, they want you to open up this little smart panel thing, that little arrow box. Choose Edit. And they want us to add the same 3 items that we added for C# Visual Basic and CSS. So if you remember how to do that, C#, Visual Basic, and I can put a space in there, and CSS. Now, if you wanted to save yourself some time, and what they're alluding to in the book here, is you could have just gone into the code view and copied the list items from the other lists. That would be just fine. But it's easy enough to type them in, and you get a little more practice with the tool, in my mind. Ultimately, your source code should look like what they have in the book at the top of page 128. And I'm just checking mine, and it looks just fine. And yours should look kind of like this. All right, and it's when we get to this point where people start getting the weird behavior. And I'm seeing the look on your faces before I do it. I know you guys are waiting for me to mess it up too. All right, but I have highlights here that really point out what I'm supposed to do because I've done it before. All right, it says for the final step, switch to markup view. That's where we already are. We're in the code view. And it says if you try to switch to the last step in design view, you may notice that the wizard disappears. Did you guys notice that? If that happens, switch to markup view and set the active step index to 0 again. Where is the active step index? Right here. Really, all they're telling you is that you're not clicked on About You anymore, and that you probably clicked on Ready, and it didn't work, right? But since About You is active for me, it was fine. Now, if you switch to markup view, you can kind of reset all that by just coming back here and setting this to 0, and it sets the focus of it back to that first item. Right? That's the step that everybody gets stuck on. Okay, it says inside the last wizard step labeled ready, that would be this little part of the code here. So inside those tags, I'm going to create a space here. Drag a label control and set its ID to result. Now, you can do that through the properties panel, or you can just hard code it just the way I did. And that's a step that we were talking about right at the beginning of the night, because this is where they get you in the book, and this is one of those steps, probably one of the most problematic steps in the whole book, that if you're not reading it right, it's easy to like misinterpret it, because it tells you to rename its ID to result, which is what I just did. Or alternately, you can do it inside the code. For the last step, type the word label and then press tab to execute a code snippet inserting a label. Do you guys understand what that means? In other words, you could type the label in instead of dragging and dropping. That's what it is indicating to you.
Sure. Well, try to read that. Type label.
Okay. Here's my little caveat for you, though. You see what I'm doing? And it puts me right where I want to be to name it, too, right? No, that's... We don't want any text in there, do we?
Well, we do, but the question is what?
Whatever.
The ones that you.
Here, Tom, this is what you should type.
Well, I already typed it. Not meaning anything, your name sucks.
Oh, but you got to say it a little more politely. We're trying to have fun with this too. So, all right, let's get that book back up on screen here. All right, so basically, one way or the other, you get this label thing in there, give it an ID of result. But if you do the little label and press tab thing, the text that goes in, it can be whatever you want. I think default they usually just say label. Whatever seems more entertaining to me, so that's what I'm doing. Okay, back over to design view, and now they want us to double click the wizard itself. So here's where you kind of got to be careful, because depending on where you double click, you might be double clicking a thing you don't want to double click, okay? So what I'm trying to do is notice that the wizard is selected, and I'm trying to be in a spot where I'm not touching any of the other controls or content. And then you can see that if I double click on it correctly, it will give me this as the thing it's attaching to. All right, so then we're going to add some code here. That code is at the top of page 129. That's going to go inside these curly brackets here. And basically what this is doing is it says result.text. So that label that we just created is going to contain this text. Your name is whatever your name is plus the text. Not really seeming to like that too much. So we must have missed a step there, huh? Did I not label something? Okay, so I think that I kind of did the wrong thing here. All right, so now I'm in the realization I skipped a step. All right, thank you for telling me now. All right, the step that I skipped, I'm back up on page 127. I skipped step number 5. All right, and what step number 5 was, it said in design view, click about you. Okay, well that's already clicked. And then in the list to the left, make it the active step and drag a label and a text box to the right side of the wizard. All right, so let's do that. A label, and I'm trying to get it into that spot. Okay, I got it. A label and a text box. All right, and it fortunately worked out just fine. For the text property of the label, so I'm coming down here to do it. I'm going to type your name. And the ID of the text box should be your name. All right. So now I'm going to go back to the step that I was on, which was, I'm sorry. All right, so I made one more mistake that people are so eloquently pointing out to me. That ID should be the your name. Yeah. You notice how I came in here and I did a Control Z and it switched back? Yeah, you can do Control Z inside of the Properties window too, just so you know. So they want the text box to have the ID of your name. Okay, now if I go back to our code window, you're going to see that that red underline that I had is now repaired. Is it? Something actually broke here. Did you guys catch what it was? Yeah, because what I did is I changed the name of that. Yeah. And then it changed it in the code automatically. But this is what it should be. Okay, so it's great when the teacher makes a mistake too. Don't you guys love it? Okay, so your code should look like this, like what's in the book. All right, so now, once again, it says switch back to design view and open the properties grid for the wizard and make sure the active step index is set to 0. So back to design view. Active step index is set to 0. That's right down here. Yeah, and see what's happening now is I'm significantly messing this up now, right? You guys are realizing that? So really the label and the text box need to be with about you, but this drop down really should be with favorite language. So watch what I'm going to do. I clicked on it. I'm going to do a cut. Now I'm going to click on favorite language. And I'm going to do a paste. Thank you, technology. It's not really cheating. It's fixing things. If I go back to about you, all right, that looks right. Favorite language. I mean, that makes sense, right? About you, what's your name? What's your favorite language? And then they keep telling us to go set that active step index back to 0. So when I do that, I'll set this back to 0. And then it puts us back to about you. See how that works? All right. So if we haven't messed it up too much, now when I hit the play button, should be able to bring that up on screen. So first thing we'll do is show the panel. Then we can type our name. Hit the drop down. Choose a language. And we hit finish, and do you see what happened? All right, I know. All right, let me go back to the code and explain what's happening in this code here. So the wizard, what the wizard does is it does a step-by-step. It has, we've got 3 different things within the wizard. One starts it, so it just goes. Then when that step is complete, it will move on to the next thing in the step. When that step is complete, our third one is a finish step, and then it executes all the code. So that's why the code here in the C# says wizard1 finish button click, meaning when we're done with all the steps, what's going to come back to the screen? What's going to come back to the screen is that the result text is going to be set to your name as whatever we typed in the first step. Then this little symbol here is where we concatenate and add to the text. A line break, so we move down to the next line, and then we output your favorite language as whatever it is, the one that we selected. That's what's happening in the background. So once again, let's run that. Panel's hidden. We turn it on. We're on step 1, that's the bold one. Type in our name. Hit next. Now we're on the second step. Choose our favorite language. And then click finish. When we click that finish button, it executes that code. Sure. I'll put the code back up on the screen. This is the C# code right here. All right, before we wrap up for the night and move into the next exercise, I'm going to talk about some of the things that they have listed here. They have lots of different controls, and if you really explore that toolbox, some things will be very apparent as to what they are, but there's lots of things that you might not even be aware that are built as tools. You can see they have tools for, or controls, excuse me, for links and image buttons, images, image maps. You guys know what an image map is? Maybe learned about it a little bit in HTML1 or Web1. And that's basically where you can take an image and set up regions of the image as clickable, as opposed to setting up buttons or links. That's kind of a fun little thing. It also has a calendar tool and a file upload tool. It has tools that allow you to basically adjust certain properties that are a little more atypical. But what I find interesting about a lot of these tools is when ASP.NET was being developed, a lot of this stuff was not native to HTML. HTML5 started bringing some of these tools in that were not present before that we'd have to do custom, which is kind of a nice little side note. They also have tools that allow you to put in ad rotators. Yep, people don't really sit and code those. They just say, I'm putting an ad rotator here, and they just drop it in. I mean, you can keep reading through here. There's all sorts of different types of controls, but they were trying to point out some common ones that people use. Now, we do have, the ability, as I was mentioning before, it's like, well, why would I bother to use an ASP text box rather than HTML text box? And there are reasons, and hopefully, I made them clear to you. Mostly it's because you want certain programmatic control over those objects. But there are times where HTML controls are fine, basically form fields. And you can still use them in the application. So which ones would you bother to use? Well, it depends on the situation, frankly. There's certain controls that you have available to you inside the ASP.NET environment, which really are built to save you a whole lot of heartache and effort. Some of the ones that they're listing here, for example, notice they have validation controls. Now, when we would write HTML code and create forms, very often we could create some very rudimentary validation with HTML5. For example, if we require a field, we add the little required attribute, and then if somebody doesn't fill it out, it pops up a little message. Other ways to do validation, and, you know, the real old school way in a web format was to write JavaScript that would test to see if whatever was entered into that text field either existed or matched certain criteria, right? So you could do it that way. But ASP.NET's got these tools built in where we can just flip a couple little switches basically, and the validation becomes automatic. And it takes care of coding out the details. We just make the selections that, you know, perform the actions that we need for our application. There's also similar types of controls that are pre-built for navigation. So for example, if you have a site structure defined and you build a site map for your application, there are tools that can automatically build your menus for you. You don't have to sit there and hand code them. You can just point to the site map structure that you've created either manually or automatically, and then just bring the control in, and the control attaches to that site list and generates a nice looking menu that works. And that can really be one of those things that accelerates. And sometimes, you know, when you're building an application that's data driven or that is dynamic, sometimes that's the only way you can do a menu, is to have it programmatically or be programmatically generated. There's also some really neat things that you can drop in too. And this is stuff that I'm actually teaching right now to my SharePoint students out in Burlington, where they're getting to the tail end of their program and they're doing some real high-level programming stuff. And we are talking about doing AJAX stuff. We will look at AJAX a little bit later in this course. And basically what AJAX is, as far as a tool, it allows us to create a page, render the page up on the screen, and then without redrawing the page, allow us to change or add certain page contents. So for example, if I were to click on, you know, a good example is like when I do email, right? Google uses AJAX extensively on their websites. You know, if I go ahead and I click a message, I'm not really even sure what this one says. All right, I'm sure this is great. Okay. And if you're looking at the browser, what's happening, the page did not reload. It almost seemed like it reloaded. In fact, even what it said up top here changed. But the truth is it didn't reload. It just went out to the server, pulled in the information it needed, changed part of the screen to accommodate what you wanted. And that approach is pretty common on a lot of websites. And what that allows us to do is render a page, not have to redraw the parts we don't need, pull in the information that we need to look at dynamically as requested. It makes the page what they call flicker free, because it doesn't flash and reload and all that kind of stuff. And there's times to use it and times not to use it, but that's one of those skills you'll learn later on too. There's also this thing that's called web parts, where we can actually kind of break things down into smaller pieces of a program and then reuse those pieces. My SharePoint students are learning, or I'm going to correct that, are about to learn web parts, where they can create pieces of programs that they can deploy inside of a SharePoint environment. So they might have a page that's created, then they have this pre-written little snippet where it's got a view and code and all the stuff that it does, and then you can programmatically bring that into any application or page that you're building in that environment. And that is one of the powerful things with ASP.NET too, is the ability to take stuff, break it into little pieces, and then reuse those pieces. So if I build, for example, this really cool expanded panel where I type in my name and choose my favorite programming language and hit finish and it puts a message up on the screen, and I want to put that on all my websites, well, I have that built now as a control. I can build my own control and take that control and move it to any project I want. So if you come up with a really slick contact form, you've done it once, why redo it again, right? You create it as a web part, and that web part can come into any project. So that's some of the power that you get in this environment, and really helps to accelerate development. Absolutely. All right, folks. I'd love to talk more. In fact, this topic here is pretty important too, but what I'm going to implore you to do is read the book carefully. If you watch the other pre-recorded lecture videos, I do talk about this in there and demonstrate it through the exercise. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.